What's up, nerds? The war in Ukraine is getting spicy, and it's not just with the Russian partisan attack in Belgorod, which we're going to talk about. There's also a speech by French President Emmanuel Macron that we need to talk about as well. Now, first, let's talk about the Russian partisan attack. Now, earlier this week, we discussed that this is launched by the Russian Volunteer Corps and the Russian Legion. This also includes the Siberian Battalion, which we did not discuss. It's more like the size of a platoon. It's, believed to be around 60 individuals. It may have grown since the data that I observed was last collected, and so it might be bigger, but last I saw it was around 60 people. And it is ideologically fighting for independence in Siberia and generally against the regime of Vladimir Putin. From what I see, they do not recruit from captured Russians in Ukraine like some of the other groups do. So that might be part of what keeps their group pretty small. From what I've seen also, this group does not appear to be far right like the other groups. That being said, I really did just kind of like a general dive into this group. I didn't do any kind of deep research, so if you know anything more about this group, definitely comment down below. I mentioned that the other groups were either associated with or were actually Nazis. And I think that is kind of an important distinction, especially as we talk about their attack in Russia today, because that is important context on who these groups and who these individuals are. While Ukraine, there's a group called the Azov Battalion in Ukraine. Ukraine's not against using these groups for their own ends. However, needless to say, they're really useful for a time such as this. And then once the war is over, it's adios. However, all combined, these Russian partisan groups attacking Russia appear to be at a strength of around 900 people, which is a pretty sizable group, but it's certainly not going to be enough to, I would imagine, take the city of Belgorod, let alone march on the city of Moscow. Really, if anything, this might just be useful enough to try to shift Russian forces into this area along the border, if anything from the combat areas down in the east and southern Ukraine or from other parts of Russia where they exist to man up the border. And if anything, we've talked about in the last video how that might increase some strain, and we'll talk more about the strategic implications here in just a moment of these attacks, because this appears to be different from how I assessed it earlier this week. They are still continuing to threaten the city of Belgorod and potentially beyond, and they are messaging for Russians to either join the fight or generally resist the government. Now, they've also captured a couple of towns along the border of Belgorod and Kursk Oblasts along the border of Ukraine, and the fighting has persisted in these areas since the attack began. Now, before I said that this looked like it would be just another raid, it appears to not have been a raid. Because again, a key feature of a raid is you take an objective and then you leave the objective. It's not designed to hold territory. In this case, they are holding territory at least longer than you would assume for a raid. They're also calling for civilians to evacuate the border area. They've also released a map showing where future attacks will happen and where they've kind of created what they call a humanitarian corridor. And we've seen videos and evidence of civilians attempting to flee Belgorod. So we'll kind of see how this situation continues to progress, because clearly it's escalating in a direction that really I didn't even anticipate it going in. We've also seen artillery duels continue along Belgorod, and we've seen artillery strikes in the city of Belgorod. With all of that happening, the Russian Ministry of Defense has stated that these attacks were initially repelled, and they also claim that they had basically destroyed the entire inventory of NATO. With anything the Russian Ministry of Defense says, again, and it's the same thing with what you get out of Ukraine, you have to take it with a grain of salt and really look for substantiating evidence. Of course, with the Russian Ministry of Defense statement that they had repelled the attacks or that no attacks had happened, yeah, we have direct video evidence that just is not the case. And even today we see, these Russian fighters operating inside of Russia. So clearly nothing was really repelled. The attack is still very much ongoing. Now, it actually gets even crazier because it's not just a ground incursion into Belgorod and Kursk Oblasts. We've also seen evidence of an air assault, reinforcement by helicopter into the captured towns in Russia. So it's clear that this may not actually be a raid. This might actually be just a general assault where they are capturing towns and they are actually holding on to them and reinforcing them to defend and to not cede the town back to Russia. And I think that that's pretty interesting because it tells us about the intentions of these groups and how, whether or not this might just be another run-of-the-mill, just kind of like event where they pop in, do something, and then they disappear for several months to regenerate combat strength, only to reappear again. they might be trying to actually do something here, even if they don't necessarily have the combat strength to actually do that. Even if they don't necessarily have the strength to do anything fairly significant, just the attacks themselves are fairly significant, if not necessarily strategically significant, then certainly politically significant. But the political significance can certainly cut both ways. We've talked about the strategic importance on these attacks, on how this may force the Russian military to move troops to the border region along the Kharkiv and Sumy Oblasts, basically along that northern border of Ukraine where we saw fighting at the beginning of the war, but since then we haven't seen much. And so that might stretch the line. That might basically increase the amount of strain on the Russian military to properly man the front line, the potential area where fighting could happen, because they're not just worried about the eastern and southern areas of Ukraine. Now they have to account for the northern area of Ukraine. And that adds a lot of frontage, a lot of land that needs to be covered. Now, ultimately, whether or not that happens, we will have to see. However, that actually kind of takes us into the political significance, because, of course, right now is the Russian election. Believe it or not, Vladimir Putin is up for re-election, and he's running after the strong political opponents of Mr. Vladimir P, Mr. Vladdy P, and Vladimir Putin. And so I wonder who's going to win. It's a tight election so far. But either way, the partisan attack in Belgorod, while Russians are out in the polls trying to vote in this election, it's not pretty. It's not a good look. This could be a black eye on Putin, especially because this was originally supposed to be a 14-day, special military operation. Now it's entering into its third year. Hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers have either died or been injured, and now Russian cities are under attack and Russian towns are being captured. That's just a complete reversal in fortune that, nobody really anticipated at the start of the war. We've seen some acts of protest against some polling stations. This isn't necessarily uncommon even for Russia. But you got to wonder how much of that is being spurred on by, say partisans saying, rise up and do something, and other groups as well. You've got Navalny and, what remains of his group trying to also kind of spur some resistance of Putin. However, all that being said, I think the political significance could be a double-edged sword for Ukraine, because, it's a bad black eye on Putin, but it could also be an excuse for Putin to mobilize even more than originally projected. Of course, it was expected that after Putin finished this election, got reelected, that there would be another round of mobilization in Russia. With what's going on right now in Belgorod and Kursk, this could be an excuse for Putin to mobilize even more broadly than he had originally planned, and that could have impacts on Ukraine. Specifically, we're talking about how Russia having to account for more frontage to, properly defend against the Sumy and Kharkiv Oblasts. That doesn't have as much strain on the Russian military if they could mobilize even further and get plenty of more bodies, into uniform. Russia has no problem getting these bodies into uniform necessarily right now. Like if they need to mobilize, they can mobilize. The problem is with equipment, and that can be, their industry is kind of moving at full tilt here, and they're outproducing the West in artillery shells and other forms of ammunition. However, again, the consumption, which we see, with battles at Avdiivka, and whenever Russia tries to go on the offensive, they consume a lot of this equipment and a lot of this manpower in these kinds of attacks. So mobilization will really help with defense, but how much will it really help Russia with the offense? But in either case, a mobilization would be a pretty significant event, especially for Ukraine and their plans for a later counteroffensive either later this year or next year, as some have projected. But it's not just that, there's this partisan attack in Russia. There's, an ongoing Ukrainian drone campaign in Russia targeting key oil and refinement facilities. These have targeted several facilities, and we talked about how that opened this partisan attack into Russia. It's actually continued, targeting several other major oil facilities in Russia. All told, some estimates project that around 12% of Russia's total oil refinement capacity has been impacted, which is a significant number. We've seen previously that Russia has stopped oil exports to other countries because they need the oil for their war. Well, the impacts on their refinement capacity just increases the strain not only on the other facilities that have to increase production to make up the gap, or on the Russian military for the decreased amount of oil that they're able to receive. It also increases the difficulty in repairing these facilities, especially since some of these facilities rely on, more advanced Western parts. And with the sanctions going on, it makes it way more expensive and difficult for Russia to gain those parts. Not impossible, but just difficult for them to gain those parts to repair those facilities. But all that being said, this war being increasingly more complicated is not just because of this Russian partisan assault. French President Emmanuel Macron made a speech, and he's getting more bold, and I like it. But we need to talk about what he said. At a base level, he said that Ukraine has to win, and he basically couched this war as existential for France, saying that the war in Ukraine will dictate the security of France, basically, and that if Ukraine loses, then France will never be the same, and French people will never be safe. Now, I think that that's pretty strong language. He also continues by saying that there are no more red lines. He did not say that French troops were going to Ukraine right now, but when asked about it, he did not deny that at some point, maybe French troops go to Ukraine. I think that this is kind of, the idea of there being no red lines. He has to say that it's not out of the realm of possibility for French troops to go to Ukraine. Even if he has no ambition to send French troops to Ukraine, no design to do so, he has to say it because the fact that he says no red lines, you have to have everything as kind of ambiguous. The French are no pushovers. I mean, remember that doctrinally, they have a nuclear first use policy, meaning they will use a nuclear weapon in a first strike as a warning shot to prevent further escalation. That's pretty crazy and bold. Read someone say on Twitter that the baguette of consequences rarely arrives buttered. Well, we're seeing that there is a baguette in Paris with Vladimir Putin's name on it, and there is not an ounce of butter or cheese on that thing. Clearly, the war is escalating in ways that Putin did not necessarily envision at the start of the war. And while Macron appears to be ready to step up and make sure that the war ends on Ukrainian terms, that may not necessarily mean that the Ukrainians are going to recapture all of Crimea or all of the territories that have been captured by Russia. Remember at the beginning of the war that Russia's overall goal, and it is still their goal, is regime change in Ukraine. They want to capture the city of Kiev. They want to change the government in Kiev back to a pro-Russian government. Anything short of that can be declared a Ukrainian victory. Anything where Ukraine is able to maintain some sort of national independence and identity can be considered a Ukrainian victory. So I think we shouldn't necessarily assume that what Macron is saying is that, Ukraine's going to take all their territory. He might, he might have some political carve out for, okay, well, as long as there is a Ukraine and that that Ukraine is democratic and is able to elect its own leaders and it's not pro-Russian, that counts as a win. So we shouldn't necessarily go too crazy, but I think that he's even saying any of this is significant. It's not like the French people are necessarily fans of what's being said either. In a recent poll of French people, 68% said that Macron's comments about the possibility of sending French troops to Ukraine was wrong. And a further 74% believe that French troops should not be sent at all. Now, those are pretty huge stats. I mean, Macron has struggled with a low approval rating really since the beginning of his presidency, and comments over Ukraine are really not having the kind of impact domestically that I think we on the outside think that they should have or would have. However, I do think that Macron is clearly trying to regain some amount of strategic ambiguity. I've talked about this before in a previous video, but he's trying to regain some sort of strategic ambiguity purely to make Putin think longer and harder about every decision he makes about this war because of the implications that it would have for other groups intervening, particularly a NATO country like France. Even if they do so unilaterally outside of the scope of NATO, it's still significant. I mean, remember, France is not a pushover. Their military is not a pushover. Russia has to calculate for these kinds of risks. However, at the same time, I think we need to be honest that this isn't the beginning of some sort of French-led intervention, nor is the Russian partisan attack in Russia the beginning of some sort of massive revolution necessarily. It's really just indications that this war is starting to turn in a specific direction, and people are starting to realize that Russia can be beat. Now, with all that being said, I want to hear what your thoughts are on this, because we talked about a couple, more complex topics. The Russian partisan attack, there's a lot to unpack there. The Macron speech, there's a lot to unpack there. So I want to hear your thoughts on either or both of those issues. Subscribe to this channel if you want to see more analysis and discussion on these topics, specifically defense, the war in Ukraine, the war in the Middle East, anything like that, because we're talking a lot about that stuff, and this is the place for you. With all that being said, like this video if you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you all next time. Later.